as human beings, we are not just, sacks of skin and bones and blood. We are also meaning making creatures. It's not sufficient to just being able to breathe and eat and digest to survive. We need to make meaning.
Hi everyone, this is Fábio Erelim from Ascension Wisdom channel in English and Educação Consciencial channel in Portuguese. And today I'm here with Dr. Angela Puca. Angela, thank you very much for having the time to talk with us.
Thank you so much for having me on and for inviting me.
Well, that's great. I was going to do an introduction saying who you are, what you do, but I think no one's better than you to tell about yourself. So could you please tell us a little bit about you?
Yes, so I'm a PhD. So I have a PhD in religious studies from the University of Leeds, and I have a bachelor's and a master's in philosophy from the University of Naples. And I'm an academic and a scholar in the field of esotericism, magic, paganism. And since that's my expertise from an academic point of view, and I think that these kind of subjects from an academic point of view are not as talked about and not as divulged, I thought of opening a YouTube channel. So that's how you found me basically, and how I landed here on developing the course for you. So I'm a religious studies scholar. That's I guess the definition that I would give myself. And I just find it fascinating to research these topics from an academic point of view. And of course, I also acknowledge the fact that these topics are also very interesting to research from a practitioner's point of view. It's just different perspectives, and they contribute to the discourse in different ways.
Definitely. My first, I have a curiosity. Well, many curiosities, but the first one is, it was very surprising to me when I found a channel and to see someone that it's approaching subjects as magic, occultism, and religion from an academic point of view. I'm pretty sure you're not the first one, but it was the first one that I encountered. So how is it possible to have an academic or scientific approach to subjects such as magic, occultism, and religion?
Well, it is possible because anything can be researched from a scientific point of view, really. And depending on the field, you will research in very different ways. So when it comes to esotericism, within religious studies, you already have different approaches, like anthropology that studies what people do, or sociology that studies the impact on society, history of religion that studies the history of a specific religious movement, and that includes also esoteric religious movements, the ones that involve forms of magic and the occult. But you also have psychology that researches these kind of topics, and there are fields in natural science that are getting interested in that as well. So yes, you can study these topics from an academic point of view, and of course it will be different from the methodology will be that very different compared to how practitioners try to research these kind of topics. So how is it possible to study them? It depends on the field. I'm in anthropology. I've also done history of religion, but I gravitate more towards anthropology. So what I do is that I do field work with people we call them practitioners. Probably most of the audience of this course will be practitioners,
Yes.
people that actually practice. And what we do as scholars, we spend time with them. We do something called participant observation, which means that we spend time with people, we participate in rituals, we even undertake initiations, and we are at the same time participants and observers. And then we try to understand those practices, understand how those beliefs are formed, how they interact with meaning making and belief making, because as human beings, we are not just sacks of skin and bones and blood. We are also meaning making creatures. It's not sufficient to just being able to breathe and eat and digest to survive, we need to make meaning. Otherwise, you don't have a reason to wake up from your bed and do all of those things. So it is also important to acknowledge that, it is, usually you have a lot of people have a lot of respect towards natural science and medicine, and that is absolutely something that I'm in favor of. I just think that in our society we tend to underestimate the importance that other disciplines also have in the life of people, because it is extremely important to keep a body alive, but then to make a good life you need to have meaning. Otherwise, what's the point of having a body that breathes and and lives and survives if you don't have a meaning to do that? And I think that religion provides that meaning for a lot of people, provides meaning and provides also a way of understanding the world, because the world in front of us can be extremely chaotic, and our beliefs help us create a model of understanding of what is in front of us. So it's not just a set of images anymore. It becomes a word, it becomes something with a certain meaning, a certain consistency. And it just changes completely the perspective that you have when you look at things around you. So you can tell, depending on the kind of beliefs that you hold, you will also behave in different ways. So I think that the beliefs that we have, the religions that we practice, the spirituality that we embrace, everything has a massive impact on the way we live, the political choices we make, the society that we create, everything. So obviously that's why it's important to study also within academia and in science, because it is something that affects humanity at a small and a large scale. It's really essential, I would say.
Absolutely, this is very interesting. I was curious. You talk about the academic approach and practitioners' approach. What's the basic difference between them? I think when I hear you explaining your research, it seems that the academic approach is seen as a third party. You're studying a group. You're not involved per se. And the practitioners, they are extremely, of course, involved with what's happening, and they might miss something about a group behavior. Am I right? Am I on the right path?
Yeah, kind of. So the scholar's perspective tends to be more external, but I'm not sure that that's the right way of putting it. I wouldn't want to disappoint my colleagues in saying that, because there are a lot of debates about the insider outsider approach, because sometimes when you are an anthropologist, you are also an insider, and then you have some scholars that are also practitioners. They are practitioners and they are also scholars. But when you research as a scholar, then you utilize a certain methodology. So I think that the most accurate and correct answer to your question would be that the methodology is different, because what you are trying to gather as a scholar is the most accurate knowledge about whatever it is that you are researching. Whereas when you are a practitioner, you are trying to gather the most meaningful and useful knowledge for your own benefit, for your own practice. So I think that that's the most substantial difference. But in terms of how that works, the methodology is completely different, obviously, because in academia we have protocols and things that are quite strict. You have to collect data in a certain way, then analyze data in a certain way, and then you will have more experienced scholars that will peer review your research, which means that they will evaluate whether the methodology was done, was executed properly, the data collection, the ethical side. Obviously, it's important because it's not the 19th century anymore. You cannot go into a group of spiritists or practitioners of any sort and just pretend that you are one of them without saying that you are a researcher.
Sure.
If you do that, your research will be invalidated, and for good reasons, because that's deceit. So you have to be So it is important. When I did my PhD, I had to go through the process of ethical approval that needed to be renewed, and all my informants had the right to withdraw their participation. They could decide whether to be anonymized or not, and all those kind of things. So there is a lot of respect towards practitioners as well. I think it didn't used to be like that in the past. Like if you look at scholars from the 19th century, I always think about the 19th century because it was a particularly bad time for anthropology when you have Fraser and Tyler and, you know, these precursors who were so-called armchair anthropologists. So they didn't really spend time with practitioners. They would just research in libraries and archives. So they weren't really spending time with them. And they also had an idea of magic and esoteric practices as something that is primitive. And that's a term that we don't use anymore in academia. It's considered, you know, absolutely disrespectful. And it is also assuming something that you cannot really assume when you are an academic. I mean, if a certain practice is primitive, you are assuming that, first of all, that these practices were only or primarily practiced in the past, and that's not true. So there's the first false assumption. The second false assumption is that even if that was the case, then it means that what happens in the past is worse than what is happening in the present. So you are endorsing a view of history that says that things go from worse to better. And that was a view very common after the Enlightenment. The idea of progress, you know, everything that is present is better than what was in the past. We even have terms in the English language such as backwardly, you know, and even in Italian we have a similar term to say that something is, you know, something that is from the past is equated to something being, you know, not progressive and not good enough. Maybe small-minded or something that is, you know, just negative. And these are all connotations that stem from an understanding of history that is a personal belief, is not really something that you can say that for certain. I mean, we cannot really tell whether the present is better than the past in terms of beliefs and in terms of everything. We can just say that things change, and the changes are in line with, you know, the technological changes are in line with the human changes, and that everything is in a state of metamorphosis, a continuous metamorphosis. But how can you really tell that one is better than the other? How can you assess that? On the basis of what? On the basis of now? Well, then that's a biased that's a biased assessment. So that's why now religious studies scholars don't have those kind of mentality anymore. You know, scholars are really respectful of practitioners, and I think that people often don't know that. People tend to assume that scientists and academics are against these kind of practices, and it's not true. I think that in natural science you may have that's a complicated matter, because in the problem with natural science is that natural science works in a way that is very different from how esoteric practices work. And there is a bit of a clash between esoteric practitioners and natural science when there is when they want to prove the so-called reality of these practices by investigating them with the methods of natural science. And that is often not successful, because I would argue that the methods of natural science are not particularly useful to investigate those kind of phenomena. But that's a very big topic. I could do a lecture just on that. But you know, the reality of these things you know, if it happens in your life and it has an impact on your life, how can it not be real? I mean, it has real effects, a real impact. So that's why I say it's a very big topic. But I would say that when it comes to social science and religious studies, I've always found a lot of respect for practitioners and these practices, especially in the UK and in the US, and even with Canadian scholars. You know, with the scholars that I have been in contact with, and I also go to conferences. There is the conference, the European Conference on a Study of Western Esotericism, happens every 2 years. This year is going to be at Malmo University in Sweden. So you have every conference, you know, every couple of years, you find that there are more and more scholars in the field of esotericism. And now there is more, they are talking more about the fact that we should abandon the idea of Western esotericism and also go towards a global esotericism, because, you know, that's necessary. So, you know, we shouldn't be European centric anymore. And so now there are also new associations that are, you know, are blooming, that have a global perspective on esotericism. But I also have a colleague who has studied Brazilian candomblé and yeah, and has done a lot of field work in Brazil. She's German, but she also speaks Portuguese, and, but she teaches in the UK, so very international.